Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you everything you need to know about using Redux with React in 2023. I mentioned 2023 because many of the popular Redux tutorials from years ago are now outdated and can't show you how to efficiently use Redux with today's technologies. On top of that, they're just far more complicated than they need to be. If you watch this video all the way through, I promise you this is the only video you're ever going to need with Redux. I want to start off by discussing what Redux is and the problem that it solves. If you already know what Redux is and you just want to implement it into your program, go ahead and skip forward in the video to the timestamp on the screen. Otherwise, I suggest you stick around for this part. If we look at a framework like React, we're often dealing with components that act as reusable elements for your web app. Each component has its own state, which generally works very well for itself, but sometimes you may find the need to have components communicate their state with each other. This is where things can get kind of messy, because in React, components can only communicate with props, and that communication only goes one way, and that's down. For example, let's say I have a React app that just contains a single page that represents a store, as well as a navbar that has a cart on it. If I click Add to Cart for a certain item, I want the number of items in my cart to change. Here's the problem though. If I'm adding them to my cart on this page, that state that keeps track of my cart is just localized to this page. How am I supposed to communicate with the navbar that the number of items in my cart has changed? If you're just using React with no extra tools, you'll have to make the piece of state in the app parent component, pass a setter function down as props to the page, and then pass the state itself to the navbar. But what if you need this cart somewhere else in your page? You'll need to add more props. What if you need to communicate it through nested components? You'll need to make these huge prop chains between multiple levels of components that can get incredibly messy, especially if your app has many moving parts. This is the issue that Redux solves. Redux, put simply, is a state management tool. Redux allows you to take certain pieces of state and, if you want, make those pieces of state global, meaning the entire application can access these global state variables without having to pass data down as props. What Redux does is allow you to communicate data between components in any possible direction. If I want an items in cart variable in one component that I can access in another component, I can create it in one, add it to the global Redux store, and then in any other component I can readily access the global store and then access items in cart. Now data flow is simple and easy instead of having to use props everywhere to communicate. I want to make a very quick and important note that Redux state is completely separate from React state. When we have a Redux store with pieces of state in it, we can't just directly reference it in React and access it. However, there is a library just for that purpose called react-redux. That is the official library for creating React apps with Redux functionality. Towards the end of the video, we'll be using that library to connect our Redux state with React. Without taking any more time, let's dive into the code to explore how we can implement Redux with React. Here, I've set up a simple React project. To show you how Redux works, it's important that we go over the three essential Redux topics: store, actions, and reducers. The Redux store is where we store all of our Redux state. The store is represented as one big object that contains each piece of state that we put in it. With modern Redux, it is standard practice to format each piece of state as an object that has a value field which holds the actual value of the state. For example, let's say I want a piece of state called count. In the store, this state could be represented as counts, and then an object with a value field of, let's say, 0 as default. So this count state is an object that contains a value field with our initial state value in it. If we assume this parent object was named, for instance, state, we could access this value by typing something like state.count.value. As another example, if we wanted a piece of state called isLoggedIn, we could type isLoggedIn, have it as an object, and say an initial value of false. If we wanted to access this from the store, we could just type something like state.isLoggedIn value, and that would access this value right here. Now this is what the store would theoretically look like once it's fully created and configured, but unfortunately it's not that simple to set it up. We'll need to explore the concept of actions and reducers to ensure that we can create our store. Let's first discuss what actions are. Actions in Redux are just JavaScript objects that specify how to modify the state in some way. For example, if we have a piece of state that represents count, we can make an action just called increment by writing const increment equals and then make it an object, and we could say type increment. Now actions themselves don't actually modify the state. That's a job saved for the reducers. The actions have a type field that represents what kind of action that action is. In our case, we're specifying that the action we want to do is increment. We can also add in a payload field to our actions as well. The payload field can be used if we need to pass data into our action. For example, if we wanted to increment count by 10, we could make another property, call it payload, and then set it equal to 10. Anytime you're wanting to pass in an argument to an action, like in this case specifying a particular number we want to increment by, we want to make sure our actions have a payload field as well. So now we've just made a simple increment action that specifies that we are wanting to increment something with a particular payload, in our case 10. By themselves, actions don't really do anything until you pair them up with reducers, which we'll go over right now. Reducers are a bit hard to simply show in code because their functionality is combined with actions in modern Redux. However, what you need to know about reducers is that each piece of Redux state is typically associated with exactly one reducer. That reducer can take in all the possible actions for that particular piece of state, and based on those actions, it will modify and update the state. So in a way, think of it like this. Anytime any action is triggered, it sends a message to the reducer and possibly a payload as well. Depending on what the message and payload is, the reducer will then go and change the Redux state accordingly. This may sound a little bit funky, but I promise it'll make a little more sense when we actually start to implement it in our code. I've spent a decent amount of time explaining the concepts of Redux, but now let's actually dive into our code to fully implement Redux in our React app. Before we get started, we need to install the two essential libraries that we'll be using. To do this, go into your terminal and then type npm install @redux.js/toolkit, and then also react-redux, and then make sure you press enter to install these two libraries. Now that we've got these two libraries installed, we can use all the functionality from them that we'll need. The first thing we should do in our Redux app is set up our Redux store, and this process is fairly straightforward. What you'll need to do is go into your main.jsx file or wherever the entry point for your app is, and then at the very top you'll want to import configure store from Redux toolkit. Next, we need to make a store variable that will represent our Redux store. To do this, we can go down here, we can write const store equals, and then we'll call our configure store function. And then all we need to do is pass in one object argument that has a reducer key. What I mean by that is we can specify an object with these curly brackets, space this out, and then make a key called reducer. This reducer will also be an object, so we can specify curly brackets for that as well. For right now, we're going to keep this reducer as an empty object because we haven't actually made our reducers yet. However, once you do make the reducers, you're going to want to import them into this file and then put them in this reducer object. The very next thing we need to do is to import the provider component from React Redux. To do that, we can just type import provider, and it'll import from React Redux. And then we want to take this provider component and then wrap it around our app down here. So what I mean by that is we want to make an opening tag for provider like this, make it as like if we're doing a React component, and then wrap our app with this provider that we just imported from React Redux. The very last thing we need to do is specify a store prop for our provider. All we need to do for this prop is pass in the store variable we made up here using our configure store. So what I mean by that is we can make a store prop, have curly brackets to specify JavaScript, and then just pass in the store that we made up here. And now that we've taken these steps in our main.jsx file, we've successfully connected our Redux store with our React application. However, we don't actually have any pieces of Redux state right now, so it doesn't really do us a whole lot of good. Let's next go over the concept of slices so that we can actually add state to Redux. Each slice in Redux represents a piece of state, and slices are how we define a state's actions and reducers. Because of that, we typically want to make a separate file for each one of our slices. In our application, if I want to make a piece of state to keep track of the number of items in our cart, I can go into our source folder here, make a new file, and I'm just going to call it cartCountSlice.js. I'm not going to be making any React components in this file, hence why it's JS and not JSX. The first thing we want to do in this file is import the createSlice function from Redux. So to do that, we can type import createSlice here, and we want to import this function from Redux. Just a moment ago, I talked about what actions and reducers are. Slices in Redux combine the functionality of actions and reducers to make the Redux implementation simpler and more efficient. And this is the biggest difference between modern Redux and using Redux a few years ago. If you learn to use Redux slices rather than vanilla Redux, you're going to save so much time and effort. Once we've created this file and imported createSlice, we want to make a variable that represents this slice, ideally one that matches the name of our file. So we'll write const cartCountSlice equals, and then we'll set it equal to this createSlice function that we just imported from Redux. The only argument we need to pass into this createSlice function is just an object. So I'll write curly brackets and then to make some space here to make this a little bit more readable. There's a couple of properties we need this object to have. The first one should be a name, and this will represent the name of this particular piece of state. We're naming this slice cartCountSlice, so we should probably just set the name to cartCount. The next thing we should pass into this object should be what we want the initial state of our cart count to be. It makes sense that if we have a cart count variable, we would want the initial value of items in our cart to be 0. Therefore, we should make an object called initial state that represents our initial state. To do that, we can just write const initial state equals, and then we'll set it equal to an object. Inside of this object, we should have a value field where we can specify the default value. In our case, we want to have 0. Remember that all of our state should be an object with the value field, hence why we declare our initial state in this way. Now that we've got the initial state specified, we can pass this in as another property to our object, so we'll just write initial state, just like this. The next thing we need to do, and perhaps the most important, is to make a reducers object inside of this slice, just like this. This reducers object will contain all the possible actions we can take with our state, which of course we can define ourselves. Each of these actions should be a function that does something. For example, let's think of logical actions for our cart count state. We should have functionality to increment it and also functionality to decrement it. Therefore, in our reducers object, we should have two actions, or in other words, two functions, one called increment and one called decrement. To do this, we can write increment with a colon, and we want this to take in one argument, which we will just call state. And then we can just write an arrow function as such. Inside of this function, all we want to do is increment the state by 1. However, we specified with our initial state that the state is an object with a value field. So in order to increment it, we should type state.value plus equals 1. And increment is as simple as that. This state argument that you're seeing here will represent the piece of state we're specifying in this particular slice. Therefore, in this case, it represents the piece of state that is named cart count. And the reason we can access state.value is because we told this slice that cart count has an initial value of 0. I want to make an important note here that this line where we're doing state.value plus equals 1 doesn't actually directly modify the state, but you can think of it that way. Technically in Redux, state is immutable, so each time we call something like this where we're modifying the state, we're actually producing a copy of the state and applying those changes to the copy, and then making that copy our new state. But for the sake of functionality, you can just think of it as modifying the state. Let's specify a comma here and add another action that will allow us to decrement the state. So I'll just actually copy and paste what we have here. I'll write this like this, and then instead of saying increment, we will say decrement, and then instead of doing state.value plus equals 1, we will do state.value minus equals 1. We've now successfully created actions to both increment and decrement for our cart count state. Let's add one more action beyond increment and decrement. We can imagine that in a store, sometimes you may want to add more than just one item to your cart at a time. For instance, if I wanted to buy 5 of one item, I should be able to enter 5 instead of having to click the add to cart button 5 times. Therefore, let's make another action. Let's just call it increment by count. That allows us to specify an amount to increment by. Just like with our other actions, we need to give it a state argument. However, we need to add one additional argument, which you will just call action. We need to add this action because when we call increment by amount, we need to pass in a value with it. When we're calling increment or decrement, we're assuming we're only moving by 1, so we don't need to pass in any argument. But with increment by amount, we need to be able to give it a specific amount, hence why we need this action. Then, as usual, we'll make this an arrow function. And then, instead of doing state.value plus equals 1 or minus equals 1, what instead we're going to do is state.value plus equals action.payload. Payload is where we store the argument that we're passing into our action. For example, if I were to call, let's say, increment by count, sorry, this should be increment by amount, not increment by count. Also increment by amount, and then I pass in 5. This 5 represents this payload, and it is stored in our action object, hence why we do action.payload. Now we've successfully created 3 actions for our cart count state. We can increment it by 1, we can decrement it by 1, and we can also increment by a specific amount. If we wanted to add decrement by amount, we could, but for now we'll just keep it with these 3 actions to keep it simple. This file is now complete, however we should now export our actions and reducers because we're going to need them in other files. To export our actions, we should write export const, and then we're going to use curly brackets, and then list off all of the action functions that we made. So we'll write increment, we'll write decrement, and we will also add increment by amount. And then we want to set all of this equal to cart count slice dot actions. All of our action functions are stored in cart count slice dot actions, so therefore this line that we're doing here is just destructuring them to store them in their own variables. I'll show you how these actions come into play in just a moment. Lastly, we need to export the reducer for this slice. That's super easy to do. All we need to do is write export default cart count slice dot reducer. Now, this line extracts the reducer from this cart count slice and makes it the default export for this file. And that's it for this file. We're completely done making our cart count slice, which means the hardest step is complete and the rest is smooth sailing. Now, all we need to do is head into our main.jsx file where we initially set up our Redux store. And then we need to import the reducer that we just exported. So to do that, I can type import cart count reducer, if I can type it right. And this should be from source/cart_count_slice.js. And this is now where this empty reducer object comes into play, and we can make it so that it's not empty anymore. We want to specify the name of our state for a reducer, which we were just going to call cart count, and then we'll set this to be equal to the reducer that we just imported. So cart count reducer like this. We've effectively just created a piece of state in our Redux store called cart count. All of the properties of cart count and everything we're going to need for it is stored in this cart count reducer. And this is the standard process for adding anything to our Redux state. We make a slice for that particular state in the format that I showed you like this, and then you want to import it into our main.jsx file, and we make a piece of state to represent that in this reducer object. Now we've got our Redux store hooked into our React app, and we have an actual functional piece of state. But how do we actually access Redux state in our React code now? Let me show you. Off camera, I made two simple components that are going to simulate the example we talked about earlier, adding items to a shopping cart on a store page and having those items update in the navbar. So first we have this navbar.jsx file that is just meant to display the number of items in our cart. And then we have the store.jsx page that uses localized React state to change the number of items in the cart, which is what you see here in the main part of this app. Just to show you how it works, I can click this plus button and you can see it is incrementing the number of items in our cart. And I could click the minus button, it is removing one item from our cart at a time. And I also have this text field here where we can add X items. If I want to add 7 of these items to our cart, I can type 7, click this button, and it'll add 7 to our cart, so it's 10. And each time it clicks, it'll add this number of items to our cart. However, notice that the number of items in our cart is only updating on this page and is not updating up here in our navbar, which is the problem we're trying to fix with Redux. In our store.jsx file, we have this React state here. But the whole point of using Redux is to replace React state if we find the need to. So let's go ahead and delete this state here that represents the items in our cart. And we'll actually want to keep this piece of React state here that keeps track of the increment amount because we will still need this. What we need to do first is import a function from React Redux that will allow us to dispatch actions that will modify our Redux store. This function is called useDispatch. To import it, we can just type import useDispatch, and as long as we've installed React Redux, it should pop up on the autofill, and it'll import useDispatch from React Redux. We'll also want to import any actions that we want to use within this component. In our case, we want to use increment, decrement, and increment by amount. So we'll import all 3 of those functions from our counter slice file. To do that, let's just type import, and we'll name each of our functions. So increment, decrement, and then increment by amount. And that was from the file that was, source/cart_count_slice. Now we've imported everything we need to get started with our program. First, we want to make a variable called dispatch that will be equal to our useDispatch hook. And to do that, we can just say let dispatch equals useDispatch as such. This is what will allow us to actually dispatch the actions that we've imported right here. If we go ahead and take a look at this increment button that we have here, we're setting the React state that we've recently deleted. The only change we need to make is to replace this state with our Redux state. And to do that, we need to dispatch the action that we want. For example, on the increment button, it would make sense that we want to dispatch the increment action. To do that in our onClick property, let's go ahead and delete this here. Instead of having set cart count, we can say dispatch, and then we can dispatch the increment action like this. And it's as simple as that. Now whenever we click this increment button, we dispatch the increment action, which we know increments our counter value by 1. And we can do the exact same thing for our decrement button. Except instead of dispatching increment, we can dispatch decrement. So to do that, we'll delete this here, because this is our decrement button. We'll say dispatch decrement, just like this. If I want to use the increment by amount action, we can do a similar thing. The only difference is that we'll need to specify a payload, which will represent the number we want to increment by. In our case, the payload should be whatever the user enters, which is what we're storing in this increment amount state right here. Therefore, to correctly dispatch this action, here's what we should do. Let's delete this plus cart count here, and instead of calling set cart count, we're going to dispatch the increment by amount. We'll say dispatch increment by amount like this, and then we're wanting to increment by whatever our increment amount is as such. So if, for instance, we have 7 in this field, then the increment about will be equal to 7, and then whenever we click this button, we will increment by 7 by dispatching increment by amount. And then because we're not using this cart count variable anymore with our React state, let's go ahead and just delete this for right now. The purpose of this whole program was to show you how Redux state could be easily used between different components. So let me now show you how we can access this cart count state readily in another component. In our example, we want to access this cart count variable in our navbar because that's where it shows how many items are in our cart. So we'll go ahead and navigate to our navbar component here. And we first need to import a react-redux function that allows us to select a certain piece of state from Redux. This function is called useSelector, and we can import it like this. We can just type import useSelector. For some reason here it's not autofilling, but I'll just need to curly brackets here. Import useSelector from react-redux. Now, anytime we want to select a particular piece of state from Redux, all we need to do is write one line. We need to make a variable for whatever we want the state to be named in our component. So we'll say let cart count. And we need to set it equal to this useSelector hook that we just imported. To select the piece of state that we want, we need to use state as a parameter, write an arrow function, and then select whatever the name of our variable is. We know we named ours cart count, so we'll do cart count and then dot value because we know it is an object that has a value field. Whenever we use a parameter like this called state, state represents the entire Redux store, which we know is just one big object containing all of our pieces of state, which are each individual objects that have a value field. Therefore, that explains why we use state.cartCount.value in order to get our cart count state. What's amazing about this useSelector hook is that it treats this state like it's a piece of React state, meaning that now whenever cart count is updated, the component that uses useSelector, which in our case is the navbar, will be forced to re-render to show the updated state. And I can show this to you in a very simple way. In our JSX, where we're just printing out the number of items in our cart, let's go ahead and print off this cart count variable. Let's go ahead and save our navbar and save our store file. Then let's go ahead and refresh this page and let's test it out. As you can see, if I click this plus button to add items to our cart, the number of items in our cart and our navbar is immediately updated. Each time I press plus here, it is immediately re-rendering the navbar and showing the updated state that we're grabbing from Redux. I can test the exact same thing with the decrement with this minus button, and you can see the number of items in our cart is going down. To test the increment by amount, I can write 10 here, add 10 items, and you can see it goes to 16 from 6, and I can keep doing that, and you can see our navbar state is now completely reactive to the state that was created in our store page. And this is entirely what Redux is for, communicating state between components. So now we've proven that this works. On our store page, we just use this useDispatch in order to dispatch the actions that we specified earlier, and these actions modify the value of our counter state. Then anywhere we want to grab this Redux state, we can use this useSelector hook here, which we can use to make a variable that represents Redux state and is reactive to any changes made to it. Right now, if we go into our main.jsx file, you can see that we only have one piece of state, and that's called cart count. Oftentimes, you may find the need to have multiple pieces of state instead of just one. After all, it's called a Redux store, so it's meant to hold multiple things. If this is the case, let me quickly show you how we can easily add more state without doing much extra work since the foundation is already set up. The first thing we should do is make a separate file for another slice. So let's say I want this piece of state to be called logged in. I'm going to go in our source here. I'm going to say logged in slice.js. And usually you should probably organize these slices to be in their own folder, but for right now, we're just doing it in the source folder. And then to avoid having to write all this slice code all over again, I'm just going to go back into our cart count slice here. I'm going to select all of it, copy it, and I'm going to paste it into our logged in slice here. And obviously, I will need to change these names around just a little bit. So for logged in, we want it to be a Boolean, so let's make the initial value of it equal to false. And then instead of calling it cart count slice, we're going to say logged in slice to match the name of our file. And then for our name field here, let's just say something simple like logged in. And then I want to change each of these actions here. Because we're working with a Boolean piece of Redux state, let's make two actions. We'll have one that is just set true and one that is just set false. So we'll go ahead and just delete this third one here. And then let's say this one is set true. And then we will set this one to set false. And then obviously for the set true one, instead of saying state.value plus equals 1, we will just say state.value equals true. And then for our set false, we'll do a similar thing. We will just say state.value equals false like this. And then we would need to update the names of our exports. So for our two actions, we have set true and we also have set false. And then we want to update the name here. So we say logged in slice.actions. And then for our export default reducer, we want to make sure it matches the name as well. So we'll say logged in slice.reducer like this. Now we have just created a slice that is completely unique to this logged in piece of state. And then if we want to add this logged in state to our Redux store, just like before, we can go ahead and save this file. And then we can go into main.jsx, and we'll just need to make sure that we import the reducer into this file. So we will say import logged in reducer, and we'll say that should be from source, logged in slice like this. And then all we need to do is add another property down here. So we'll say comma, we'll name this one logged in, and then like the one above it, we will set it equal to its own reducer that we just imported. So we'll say logged in reducer as such. Now we've effectively just created another piece of state in our Redux store. If we want to change the value of the state, we could dispatch the set true or set false actions. Or if we wanted to use it somewhere else, we could use the useSelector hook, just like we did with the cart count variable. And that's going to wrap up this video. This is the modern way to implement Redux into your React application. I hope this was able to help you learn Redux along the way. If you have any questions about Redux or anything else, feel free to drop them down in the comments and I'll try and reply ASAP. I'm also approaching 1,000 subscribers, so I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe or at least like the video, as your support helps me out tremendously. Take care everyone and have a great rest of your day.